Chapter 1 explained the smoothest way to connect two chords whose roots are a perfect fifth or a perfect fourth apart. I will refer to this part writing that we learned in Chapter 1 as being method number 1. Chapter 2 will introduce two other procedures, which I'm going to refer to as method number 2 and method number 3. Now, these are my own terms. They are not in widespread use in the theory world. So don't expect your friends who are music majors at other schools to know about methods 1, 2, and 3. You can teach them about it and tell them that it's a Dr. T thing. Here are some progressions showing the three methods that we've talked about. Measures 1, 2, and 3 illustrate method number 1. So I won't spend a lot of time on them. To review, this part writing requires three things. First of all, you keep the common tone stationary in the same voice. Second, you move the other two upper voices by step in parallel thirds, parallel sixths, or parallel tenths. If the bass is moving by fifth, that motion will be in contrary motion to the bass. If the bass is moving by fourth, the motion will be in similar motion to the bass. And finally, you will retain the same structure. So if you do it correctly, you will start in close position and end in close position, or you'll start in open position and end in open position. So looking at measure 1, for example, you can see that we've kept the common tone, the D, which is both part of D major and part of G major, in the alto voice. The soprano and the tenor are moving by step up, T to do and Re to Mi. This is in contrary motion to the bass when the bass is leaping down by fifth, but these voices move by similar motion to the bass when the bass is going up a fourth. Method number 1 is a very good method to use because it's really pretty much foolproof. You can't make mistakes with this except doubling and spacing errors, but the part writing itself is very simple. One of the problems is that it's a little bit static, and so you sometimes get repeated notes with the common tone in the soprano. Let me just review the scale degrees that go to other scale degrees when 5 goes to 1. In method number 1, what we have is Re going up to Mi, we have Sol staying on Sol, and we have Ti going up to Do. Now let's take a look at the next 4 measures. Measures 4 and 6 illustrate method number 2, and measures 5 and 7 also illustrate method number 2, but with a variant where we triple the root of the 1 chord. The method number 2 part writing requires that you, first of all, move in the opposite direction from measure 1. So in method number 1, like over here in measure 1, going from the 5 chord to the 1 chord, the upper voices that moved move up. But going from 5 to 1 with method number 2, the voices that move, which is all of the upper voices, move down. So this is excellent if your melody is going from Re down to Do, which, for example, is a very common way to end a song. Second, there are no common tones kept between the 2 chords. All of the upper voices are moving. 2 of the voices are moving by third, and that's in parallel motion to each other. And then 1 of the upper voices is moving by step in similar motion to the other 2 upper voices. The upper voices will move contrary to the bass if the bass is moving by fourth, or if the bass is moving by fifth, as here in measure 6, they will move in similar motion to the bass. And then another feature of method number 2, like method number 1, it will retain the structure of the chord, so that if you start in close position, you'll end in close position. If you start in open position, you will end in open position. Now let me show you the variant that we have in measure 5 and in measure 7. In this variant, the T does resolve up to Do. And again, that's because the scale degree 7 is a very strong tendency tone. It is not a mistake, as long as that note is in an inner voice, to have it leap down to sol, like it does in measure 4 and in measure 6. That would also be fine if it were in the tenor voice, because the tenor is another inner voice. But if you are uncomfortable with the leading tone not resolving to tonic, you can always choose to resolve the leading tone up to tonic. What you'll get then is a final tonic chord that has 3 tonic notes in it. It has no chordal fifth, and it has a third. Be careful that you don't leave the third out of the chord. That would be an error. That's a wrong kind of incomplete chord to write. We need the third so that it sounds like a triad. This is a major triad. This is a minor triad. But if you don't have a third, if you just have this, that's nothing. That's not major or minor. So be sure that you always have the third in the chord. So the scale degrees in method number 2 proceed like this. Re goes to do. Sol goes to mi, or may if we're in minor. And ti leaps down to sol if it's in an inner voice, or it can resolve up by step to do. Now, direct your attention to measures 8, 9, and 10. These show some of the pitfalls of method number 2, which is not completely foolproof. Let's look at measure 8. I'm going to go ahead and establish the sound of G major by playing a 1-4-5-1 progression. Okay, and now I'm going to play number 8 for you. And that's very unsatisfying for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have the frustrated leading tone in the soprano. The leading tone does not go to tonic. Again, the T leaping down to sol is fine if it's in the alto or the tenor. It is not fine if it's in the soprano. And later on, we'll see that it's not fine if it's in the bass also. Second, and this makes it even worse, the soprano and the bass are moving by similar motion, and they're moving into a perfect fifth. So we have a direct perfect fifth with the bass soprano GD being approached by similar motion with a leap in the soprano. Now, number 9 corrects part of the problem. Simply by changing the octave that you put the bass note in, you can get rid of that direct fifth. And that's something that you can do in other contexts as well. So one of the easy ways to make sure that you don't have a direct fifth or a direct octave is, if you can, just change the direction that the bass is moving. However, 9 is still incorrect because the leading tone is still frustrated, doesn't resolve. Number 10 is correct because here we're using that variant where we triple the root of the tonic. We have a G in the soprano, a G in the alto. We do have a third in the chord, a B in the tenor, and a G in the bass. So number 10 is very similar to measures 5 and measure 7. And finally, measures 11 and 12 show you method number 3. This part writing is much less common, but it is sometimes useful. And this requires 5 things from you. Count them. First of all, you are going to keep the common tone, and you're going to keep the common tone in the alto voice. So notice that in both of these measures, the D, the shared note between D major and G major, is here in the alto. Second of all, you're going to move the soprano and the tenor in contrary motion, either diverging away from the alto or converging towards the alto. Third, in either the soprano or the tenor, you will skip from the chordal third of the first chord to the chordal third of the second chord. Okay, so here we skip from the F sharp to the B in the soprano. In measure 12, we skip from the F sharp to the B in the alto voice. Now, Generally, you're going to run into problems if you move one of the upper voices by fourth or fifth. If you do that with the chordal fifth, you will have parallel or contrary fifths with the bass. If you do it with the chordal root, you will have parallel or contrary octaves with the bass. But if you do it with the chordal third, you will have parallel or contrary thirds. In measure 12, you can see more clearly the parallel thirds that you have. Fourth, in the remaining voice, you're going to move by step. And of course, that's in contrary motion. So in measure 11, as the F sharp leaps up to B, the A goes in contrary motion down to G, and also in number 12. And finally, this is the only method which will allow you to move from a close position chord to an open position chord, or an open position chord to a close position chord. So that's what it's really useful for. If you do this correctly, here's what the scale degrees are going to do. We're going to go from re down to do. We're going to go from sol to sol, staying in the same place. And we will move from ti to mi, or may. I'll point out that in number 12, I do have a very small voice overlap. Generally, the smaller a voice overlap is, the less of a problem it is. Here I have just a very small voice overlap of a half step. The bass leaps up to the G, and the G actually overlaps into the tenor's range because it's a half step higher than the note that the tenor had in the first chord. A voice overlap of a half step or even a whole step, I'm usually not going to get too bent out of shape about, but do watch out for larger voice overlaps. We're going to turn our attention fairly soon to example 2.2 in your textbook, and you might find it helpful if you have your textbook handy to look at the example, although I will be showing it to you also in the screen. This example will show some examples of these three part writing methods that I just discussed, but it also illustrates how we can think of a 5 chord as being either a passing chord or a neighbor chord or an incomplete neighbor chord connecting two tonics. As a way of working our way into this concept, I made a sort of different version of example 2.2, and you can see it on your screen here. You can tell by the bass voice that I am simply sitting on a 1 chord. 1 is prolonged all the way through this example. It's very clear, therefore, that the notes that we have on the second half note of each measure are a non-chord tone. These are notes that are not part of C major or C minor. So I'll play these for you. In the first measure, you have a lower neighbor note. Measure 2, an upper neighbor note. Measure 3, you have a passing tone. And in the last measure, now in C minor, you have an incomplete neighbor note. This is an example of an incomplete neighbor note, which is a neighbor only to the note that follows it. So the B natural is a lower neighbor to the C. It's not a neighbor to the E flat because that's too big a distance between them. And so that's what makes it an incomplete neighbor. It's a neighbor on one side, but not on the other. Now, notice how each of these non-chord tones is harmonized with a 5 chord in example 2.2 from your textbook. The first 4 parts of example 2.2, A, B, C, and D, correspond to my 4 examples above. The effect is still to prolong the tonic harmony. We would say about this example that in each of these 3 chord groups, the 5 chord is an embellishing chord connecting the 2 tonic chords, thus prolonging tonic harmony. Tonic is perceived as being more structurally important. Okay, so we have the same labels for a lower neighbor note, an upper neighbor note, a passing tone, and an incomplete neighbor that we had in the previous 2 examples. But now, instead of these being literally non-chord tones, they are now examples of linear motion which is harmonized by a 5 chord. Let me play these first 4 examples for you. In letter B and in letter C, we have an incomplete tonic chord with 3 roots and a third. I will often label this or abbreviate it on the whiteboard as being a chord that's RRR3. In other words, root, 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 and a third, but no fifth. These brackets are showing the tripling of the root. And here again in letter C. In example 2.2, can you pick out where method number 1, method number 2, and method number 3 are used? Look in each of the 6 examples, A through F, and look both at how the 1 chord goes to the 5 chord, and then how the 5 chord goes to the 1 chord. Sometimes they both use the same method. Sometimes one method is used going to the dominant, and then another method is used returning to the tonic. If you are interested in doing this little test on your own, I would recommend that you do it. And down here at the bottom of this part of the handout, I have put the answers to that, so you can figure it out and then check your answer if you want to, and see if you really understand methods 1, 2, and 3. And finally, in my 3rd lecture coming up, I will talk a little bit about some of the material that's at the end of chapter 2 that talks about phrases and periods, and I'll have some more to say about cadences.